Okay, so I'll get started. Good morning. So for this adult forum today, I wanted to give a little bit of information about the prophets and share. This is kind of like my final project from a course that I took this spring on the prophets. And there's so much to say about the prophets. What I hope to do with this time with you is just give an introduction to some of these ideas about what prophecy is, who the prophets are, how to read them, and then also think about the implications for prophetic ministry. And I think that's especially important given this time in the life of St. Mark's congregation to think about our call process and so what are the implications for prophetic ministry on our idea of a pastoral theology, for example. So I'm going to be looking at Joel specifically, but more broadly, I want to give an introduction to the idea of the prophets and where they exist within our biblical tradition. So 3 parts today. We're going to talk about what is a prophet, look at Joel, and then have a couple of key issues or discussion time, but I also want to make this interactive, so please interrupt me if you want to drill down into anything as it comes up. So what is a prophet? So I'm using some art today too to just kind of evoke a little bit more what we mean when we say what is a prophet. So this is actually a piece of art by John Singer Sargent that's in the Boston Public Library. It's called The Frieze of Prophets. So here you have Moses in the center, Elijah and Joshua, and then Jeremiah, Jonah, Isaiah, Habakkuk, and Amos, Nahum, Ezekiel, and Daniel. So these images are really evocative for me, as we'll see, and as we understand what a prophet is. And they are people that are really standing in that place between the people of God and between the inner heart of God. And that's a very fraught and urgent and emotional place. It can't be anything else. So this is just a close-up of a part of that frieze, and Joel is the one who's hiding his face, and John Singer Sargent actually divided the prophets into 2 groups, and this is the group called the despairing prophets. So one thing that I've learned and I do want to share with you is this idea of prophets as intermediaries. So prophecy involves intermediation between God and the community and interacting about revelation with an audience. So it's not something passive. It's not something that, it's really this idea of being caught up in both the very sweetest, most eternal inner heart of God and with the life of a people. So sometimes it's easier to say what a prophet is not. So a prophet is not a fortune teller. It's not a future teller. It's not a social activist. It's not a spokesperson. It's not defined by an office or role or ordination, and it's not defined by social location. So within the biblical tradition, we see prophets who are very, very poor, and we see prophets who are who live their entire lives with kings and priests, and so that they can move throughout various rungs of society. So again, I like this idea that the prophet stands in between God and the people and provides that intermediation. So you'll see I'm citing CST. I'll talk about resources at the end, but it's a book by Cook, Strong, and Toole. I also use a lot from my professor last semester, Jen Hens-Piazza, who's the Old Testament biblical studies scholar we have at seminary. So this is actually her graphic. So the prophet is not a mediator. The prophet is not one who's simply speaking on behalf of God to the people. It's not this one directional movement. It's a dynamic, interactive position. So the prophet stands in the midst of the people and in the midst of God, and it's bi-directional and it's active. Is this sort of what you have in mind for what a prophet is, or does anybody have any ideas about what prophecy is that maybe doesn't align with this? This is surprising. I found this really powerful, this concept of intermediation.
Hey, Meg, so just help me understand.
Yeah.
So like, would Moses be like a mediator, like someone who's like, helping channel the word of God, or?
Yeah, so I think Moses is the prophet par excellence
Yeah.
because specifically, exactly, he is one who, to whom God revealed God's self in a very intimate way. And then Moses then had that interaction with God and then took that to the people and had that interaction with the people and then took what the people were saying and brought that back to God. So it's this kind of, it's a multi-directional movement and that I think gives rise to what we'll get into next, which is how the prophets speak and what that's like to exist as a prophet. Did you have a question?
Yeah, you find, what kind of difference do you find between the definition of prophet in Islam and Christianity, as well as with two different denominations within Christianity? They have a lot of gospel preacher calling themselves prophets.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, I think many people claim to be prophets, or, I'm not sure if I can speak to that, but I don't know a lot about Islam. I mean, I think that certainly that conception of a prophet is different than what we're talking about here. The thing that I'm focusing on here is really a Christian perspective, but certainly, grounded in the Hebrew Bible. But this is really that conception. So again, the prophet is an intermediary, one who can speak to God for the people and one who can speak for the people to God. And so what is required of an intermediary? First, it's someone who is steeped in sacred traditions and caught up in relationship with the divine. So it's someone who's well schooled in understanding how to worship God, how to speak to God, what the sacred texts say. And then it's also someone that understands the community and someone who's caught up with the community. So I kind of think of this as someone who is both in love with the heart of God and in love with the heart of the people at that time, at that place. And it's those two areas of love that actually empower prophecy. So then implications for prophetic ministry, I'll just open a brief parenthesis here. So regarding mediating God, this comes with that responsibility for knowing sacred traditions and a responsibility for a lifelong effort at deepening one's own spirituality. And then also regarding mediating the people, there's a responsibility to always have a strong, deep, and authentic relationship with the community, but always to exegete or to study and pray with the sacred text of the community. So each person who lives is a sacred text. And that's something that God has made and woven in terms of the events of our lives. But then together as a community, we are a sacred text and a living text that can be read and loved and brought to life. So just a bit of history here. So this prophetic tradition is one of the three great biblical traditions in Judaism. So there's the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, the writings, and the prophets make up that second part. There's also a division within the prophets. So there are the three major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the minor prophets. And they're called minor because they're relatively brief compared to Jeremiah, and they actually would always fit on one scroll. So you'll see instances in Hosea, Joel, and Amos that kind of talk to each other. And the thinking was that because it was an oral tradition, they would have been read or experienced as one. So that's where Joel sits within this tradition. And this image is actually a Greek translation of the Minor Prophets scroll. And so that's just interesting. And this right here is the name for the divine in a Paleo Hebrew script. So the person who is really associated with modern scholarship on the prophets is Abraham Heschel. He was also very active in the civil rights movement. And so in this next part, I want to share some of his ways of conceiving of what a prophet is. And then I recommend his book if you want to dive deeper into understanding who the prophets are. So Heschel says that the prophet's language burns. So they have a breathless impatience with injustice. And so he asks, if that strikes us as hysterical, then what name should be given to the abysmal indifference to evil, which the prophet bewails? The prophet's theme is, first of all, the very life of a whole people. His life and soul are at stake in what he says and what is going to happen to what he says. So if we think about the prophet's language, it can sometimes seem abrasive, urgent, chaotic. And that's because this prophet is someone who has the ear of God and is listening to God. And so, if we think about call stories, especially with Isaiah, the angels actually fly and place a burning coal on his mouth. So that's the power with which the prophet speaks, and that's what animates his words. So they seldom tell stories, but they cast events. They don't sing, but they castigate. And they're a preacher whose purpose is not self-expression or the purgation of emotions, but rather communication. And his images must shine, not shine or be interesting, but they must burn. And the prophet is intent on intensifying responsibility. So within the life of the people, it's not about casting blame or guilt, but to say, wake up and look at what we're doing as a people, and what is our relationship as a living people to our living God. So the prophet is a man who feels fiercely. God has thrust a burden upon his soul, and he's bowed and stunned at man's fierce greed. These are, again, this is all from Heschel. Prophecy, and this I really love, and I think this is what's important. Prophecy is the voice that God has lent to the silent agony, a voice to the plundered poor, to the profaned riches of the world. It is a form of living, a crossing point of God and man, and God is raging in the prophet's words. And so to a person endowed with prophetic sight, everyone else appears blind. And to a person whose ear perceives God's voice, everyone else appears deaf. So the prophets can seem, I just have this conception of them as sort of like wide-eyed, and maybe, we would probably experience them as like a little bit crazy, a little bit threatening. But it's coming out of actually, again, this state of being in love with the heart of God and in love with the heart of people. So the prophet's word is a scream in the night. While the world is at ease and asleep, the prophet feels the blast from heaven. So we'll talk about Joel, and I actually have no idea what time it is. Going on, 16, okay, great. So this is again a frieze of prophet. So again, I love this idea of movement, of casting, of this expression, and also just that the prophets come from kind of this team of prophets that God has appointed and are speaking to us throughout these traditions and throughout time. So Joel, so where do we know the prophet Joel? This is a reading that we always hear on Ash Wednesday. Return to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. Rend your hearts and not your clothing. Return to your God who is gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and relents from punishing. So this is actually an echo back to Exodus 34, where God passes in front of Moses and says, I am Lord, Lord, and discloses God's name and says that the Lord is abounding in mercy and slow to anger. Additional references to Joel, we encounter that at Pentecost. So Peter at Pentecost kind of echoes back to Joel's statement that says, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions. So that was applied by St. Peter in his sermon at Pentecost, the events of that day. This is a painting of Pentecost. So I'm using Joel as kind of an example to get at the prophets, but there are so many. I think my favorite prophet is probably Isaiah, just because of the immense poetry and beauty of that language. But Joel is a minor prophet, so again, we don't really encounter him that much, but I think he's representative of this tradition in which a prophet calls the people to wake up from their lives, to see God in the unfolding of day-to-day events, and to rend their hearts and change who they are relative to each other and relative to their God. So what do we know about Joel? We actually don't know that much from a biblical scholarship perspective. We know that the name means Yahweh is God, or one to whom Yahweh is God. We think he prophesied in Judah and Jerusalem. He's placed second in the minor prophets, the book of the 12. We get the sense that he's familiar with the priesthood. So we don't, probably he was around temple service in Jerusalem. We don't really know. Unlike other prophetic books that sometimes clearly place the prophetic tradition within history, there aren't really mentions of major world events. So we think basically in conclusion that Joel was likely a post-exilic prophet who lived in Jerusalem. And then there are two parts to this book. The thing that Joel's always associated with is the plague of locusts. So the first part is the plague of locusts and the call to return. And the second part of the book is deliverance, judgment, and victory, God's victory. So that's kind of how this is set up, and the two parts obviously speak to each other and are linked throughout the text. So the other thing to know about this plague of locusts is that this was not merely something that was gross or inconvenient. A plague of locusts could have caused desolation and famine and death. This was a really hugely important and dangerous thing if a plague of locusts came to your society. And this is central to Joel. And for Joel, this plague serves as a primary eruption into world history. So it's sort of an inbreaking of God's reign. The locusts are described as a fierce nation, the bite of lions and fire. And in Joel, we see that the deadly effects of the plague is used to impress readers with God's judgment and remind them that there's more judgment to come. And this, the idea would be that this judgment would then provoke a return to prayer, lament, fasting, and a return to God. So Joel as a prophet sees God at work in the day-to-day events of his day and in his crises, but these also seem to prefigure an end time. So this is not just a discrete event, but for Joel, this is part of cosmic time and of God's plan. And so there's no hint that it's interesting to think about, how did Joel or these writers experience events like this? Were they seen as punishment from God, or were they seen as being morally random? I think scholars have different views on that. But I think the one thing that folks seem to agree on is that natural crises seem to recur randomly, but what we see in Joel and in the prophets is that God is available for supplication and prayer when they do. And figures like Joel served as an intermediary to bring the cries of the people to God to ask for help. So this is a famous and oft quoted line from Joel: "Alas for the day of the Lord is near, and as destruction from the Almighty it comes." So that's Joel is also always talking about the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord. So how can we read the prophets, or what should we do with these prophetic texts? There's in biblical scholarship, there's a tradition in which we're encouraged really to read the prophets only within the tradition of the Hebrew Bible. So in other words, not looking at that text to understand what that might prefigure about Christ, but to actually read the text on their own, in their own moral universe with their own implications. There are others who say that, that's really, we actually should read them in light of the New Testament, in light of Jesus, and that the book's main doctrinal contribution in the Christian tradition is its prophecy of the outpouring of the Spirit, who will descend on all peoples of God in the Messianic era. And so again, we talk about how in Acts, Peter quotes this at Pentecost. And so we actually can read this text too as a message of Messianic hope, that judgment will actually provoke the victory and the salvation that God will bring about. So just some, again, there's so many prophets, there's so much to say. Joel is just an example that I'm using today, but I think the key takeaways for this text that I find really beautiful and interesting, Joel offers this collective expression of mourning and dependence on God. it's not just one person, but it's an entire society, it's an entire group of people that are asked to change their inner heart and disposition and return to God. And there's this idea that God expects people's hearts to be penetrated by disasters, and that these disasters will actually turn people to the temple to rend their hearts and not their clothing and to return to God. And this was part of Israelite culture. So there were periods of collective lament, and these were occasions of amendment of life and restoration of communal interdependence. And these were, there were practices around this. So, you would wear itchy garments, you would put ashes on your face and so on. And so Joel alludes to some of those. So I thought we could turn to some discussion at this point. So one thing I'm wondering, of course, you're familiar with prophets other than Joel, but how do you envision or understand how the prophets received what they then spoke about God? So for example, what is that experience like? Is it revelation? Is it something that occurs in prayer? Or what is that meeting point with God's heart like for these prophets? So I don't know if that resonates with you or, yeah.
It's a revelation to me. I had never thought about it at all.
Yeah, about
Trying to
prophets.
make a distinction between prophets,
Okay.
between prophets.
So you were saying you hadn't thought about this idea of prophets as kind of a group of,
That's right. This is an introduction. To
oh, great. Yeah,
Thank you.
great. Yeah, no, it's so rich. There's so much to discover. And then the other question that I have, right on time, is how does this, well, I just want to open it up in general, but how does this idea of prophecy, this idea of prophecy's intermediation change your conception of ministry? Has anything come to mind for you about this conception of kind of pastoral theology of prophetic ministry? That's why I was smiling. Big question. So don't expect a lot. Trying to think if there's anything else here. This is the book that I was saying, The Prophets by Abraham Heschel, if you wanted additional reading on this topic. And then this is just the bibliographies of things that I relied on. And of course, Jenna and Piazza, my professor, really framed a lot of these conceptions, especially that of the intermediary. Yeah, so I can end early if no one else has questions, but Ken. Oh, sure.
Because when you read through some of the prophets, there's a lot of commonality in terms of the themes and messages, et cetera. I guess when you think about like a prophet in today's contemporary environment, like what does that look like? What does that person look like? What kind of message does that look like, versus some of the historical text?
Well, I mean, to me, the first issue I think about is climate change. And I think that that's a prophetic voice in that context would be screaming at the top of their lungs about what we as a people have done, that screaming or that expression comes not from hysteria, but from a deep love of the people that this tragedy will affect, a deep love of the people and a loss of the relationship that those people have to their God and Creator because of this thing that has happened, because of I think how we have gone wrong. And we don't like to talk about that, but to me, it feels, climate change and global warming, this is quite sinful. I think this is what the prophets would decry. And so I think a prophetic voice in today's world, that's the example I would think of, would be someone then who would pray to God and say, please help us. I'm so sorry. We will change. We will rend our hearts. We will return to you and try to do better. But in terms of how that comes across, I think this prophetic urgency and just wild desperation to be heard, because the prophet is also pierced with the agony of God's own heart. And the prophetic voice makes us realize that God cares so deeply about us. And it almost seems absurd that God should care about our day-to-day lives or what happens, but that's what the prophets and our faith reveals to us, that this is a point of heartbreak for God, that we're not turning toward God to be near God again. So prophecy and prophets give voice to those tragedies, but I think are just that bridge that kind of knits together the human society, and as we stand before God. But that's a great question. I don't know if anyone else has other ideas about what prophetic ministry might look like or sound like today, or for prophets in general, not just ministry.
Yeah, man, what you're making me think about is, how do we talk with our call committee? Maybe one of the questions in the interview is, tell us a little bit about how you see ministry as being prophetic. So, is your preaching prophetic? Is your proclamation, is your witness, is your lifestyle prophetic? And what all that means. And again, I love the way you summarized it and said, part of being prophetic is just to let people know that God is with them and loves them. But then to encourage people to also move into the, however, unless you show that you love God and are doing God's will, then so many things can happen that wouldn't have to happen if we weren't being more active. So how can a preacher be prophetic? Has to be prophetic in their word. So great question.
Yeah.
Open-ended answers, but great question.
Yeah, and I think again, I've repeated this, but I think that was the breakthrough of this class for me, is that this prophetic position or place, it comes from this being in love with the people in that time and place, and being in love with the inner heart of God. Both of those things. So you're not. That's why this isn't fortune telling. This isn't social activism. This is rooted in a deep, 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 deep love of God's heart, and a deep, deep love of the people that God created, and wanting to strengthen those relationships. And so everything kind of comes from that place in prophecy.
Would you consider prophet has to be a lot more emotional than all of us, because we're just ordinary congregants and we all try to be reasonable. But reasonable and then water down a lot of the emotional aspect. It seems like those in the Bible, they suffer nothing. They say it out loud. They got persecuted by it. So there's a huge difference between prophetic ministry and just ordinary feeling. Okay.
Your question is, do you think that to have prophetic ministry, you have to be more emotional than others? I don't know if I would say emotional necessarily. I think it's a heart that's pierced with very, very deep feeling, and sometimes that can produce emotions that other people can see. But I don't think it necessarily has to be kind of always evident hysteria, but I think there's that depth of feeling that's born of a deep compassion.
Not necessarily in terms of what you say out of our voice, but also what you write.
Yeah, so I mean, a sermon would look different if you're fueled with that fire that comes directly from God. And that's when we can read some of these prophetic, if you read what the prophets are saying, the language is as Heschel says, it burns, it's fiery, and it's because it's not the emotion you have when you go to your therapist and you cry about something that happened to you. It's the emotion that comes from the very depth of your being, which itself is anchored in God's heart. So it's the emotions of God's heart. It's God's mourning and sadness and joy, God's longing for us, God's saying, you're my beloved and I loved you first. And you know, come, let us run, you know, like the Song of Songs talks about that. That's another thing I would love to bring maybe in another time. There's so much to say about Bernard of Clairvaux's sermons on the Song of Songs, but this idea that, you know, that can be read as kind of like an icon of the whole Old Testament, but this idea that God loves us first and asks us to run in this amazing love affair. Come, let us run. Come be with me, be my beloved. And all of the tenderness and romance and mystical connection that kind of framing suggests. But yes, I mean, to your point, you know, one thing I wrote down is the prophet hates the approximate, shuns the middle of the road. To the prophets, the seemingly minor aches of injustice inflicted on the poor and the powerless are cause for the greatest concern, because indeed in God's heart, that's the case.
Martin Luther comes to mind, of course, you know, because before that time, it was very much kind of a top-down affair, very scholastic, you know, church's wisdom and intellect, etc., top-down. Luther came along and said, no, it's a two-way street. We can have a direct conversation with God, right? Not through them. You might equate that with social activism, but to me, there was an anger that burned within Martin Luther, you know, that said we need to have a two-way discussion with God. So he comes to mind. Another one that comes to mind, honestly, is Martin Luther King.
Oh, yeah.
The social activism, yes, but also a conversation between the Lord and his relationship with God.
Yeah.
Controversial.
No, but and you make a good point. I don't mean to suggest that prophecy excludes social activism. I mean to suggest that I mean to offer a deeper sense of the core meaning of prophecy that may include social activism, not as an end in itself, but as a means to represent, you know, God's love to God's people and God's people's burning desire to return to God and to do justly and love mercy. You know. Get them early. Unless anyone has other prophetic ideas. Oh, Pastor Lyle.
Who's your favorite prophets?
I was saying I love, who's my favorite prophet? Deutero Isaiah. I think we were talking about that a little bit, the poetry and the sweetness, and you know, we read that a lot during Advent because it's just the most comforting expression of hope and trust and expectation and comfort from God. And I love the imagery and the tenderness and the poetry. I love his call story, everything. So I'd say Isaiah. Anybody else have a favorite prophet? Joel's not my favorite prophet. I appreciate him, but he's that's okay. He's just like
Would you say all of those, every single prophets, they are social, is social activists?
is every single prophet a social activist? I don't think strictly that's the case. I don't know. What do you think, Pastor Lyle? I mean, I think that prophecy always includes a social dimension. I don't know that it always includes social activism. It includes care for the commonality of people and an urging toward justice and
Yeah, we talk about social activists, we're talking about someone who's involved in a whole group.
yeah.
So it seems to me that most of those prophets, no rangers.
They can be. Well, I mean, I think being inhabiting that place can be a lonely place because you're hearing the heart of God, and no one else can hear that as a prophet can. And you're also, so you're kind of drawn between these two loves, and people might not understand you, but you're compelled to keep speaking because you can't do otherwise, because it's God himself that's speaking through you. So I would imagine lots of open place. Well, thank you very much. I hope that you take a look at the prophets and, yeah. Oh, Martha.
It's not about profits, it's about money. I just wanted to invite all of those who were present for today's adult forum and will be staying after the 11 a.m. service to join us during the fellowship hour after the 11 a.m. service. Our Sunday school families will be sharing our appreciation of Meg, who's taught our children for the last year. So please join us in a brief and very, very heartfelt reception for Meg after the 11 a.m. service.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.